even. No two people can be alike, with the idea that while they were in their earthly life walking with him, hopefully, they would develop these to their maximum. But he said, because of sin, nobody develops those talents I give. So he said, I bring them up into their own paradise, which is that place that they would most have enjoyed, could they have picked it out, for their individual desires and dreams. He said, I told you I'll give you the desires of your heart, and they should be a heavenly place.
I go to prepare a place for you.
Right.
And didn't you point out one time that even in John 14, where he says, in my Father's house are many mansions, that's an old English word. It really doesn't mean, the Gone with the Wind mansion with the pillars in front, does it?
Actually, what it means, in the best Greek translation that I can find, is Jesus' reference to something they understood as he was talking, which was the temple. And the word mansions in King James is the word used for the cubicles. It's really the word cubicle that were in the temple along the sides, and each priest had his own cubicle, and each person that worked there of any rank had his own cubicle. And these cubicles, being in the temple of God there in Jerusalem, of course, were the finest thing that a person could aspire to. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus used them as illustrations. The other word, besides cubicles, is abode. Just a place of
abode,
of spending time in the presence of God is really
okay.
the kind of abode it is. See? Such as.
And since you were a real botanist and flower lover, he gave you a botanical garden.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And of course then he did the cute little thing. Jesus is always full of little tricks. I presume that he was winking to his disciples every now and then as he talked to another one. See? And I had always disagreed with the possibility, as told in Revelation, that there could be liquid gold that you could see through. Mm-hmm. Streets of gold. Mm-hmm. I went to the chemistry, I went to the physics lab. There's no such thing. You heat it, you pound it, even when it's quintesimally thin, it's still solid. Mm-hmm. It's an impenetrable thing on earth. Mm-hmm. And yet it says you see through it. And Jesus knew that. What did he do? He had me land in a bed of white flowers that had golden centers, the calyces and the pistils and the stamens of liquid gold. And instantly, as I looked down at this bed of flowers, I was looking longitudinally through the stamens, right down to the stem, through liquid gold stamen. Mm. And I heard myself say, and of course he was doing, thank you, Jesus. Now I know anything's possible. Well, that's just a little sidelight.
Did you pick any of the flowers?
I did pick them. And this was what was so interesting. The one thing I did remember about Earth was that I'd been married to a lovely lady. And I decided that the two of us being one must have had a common tragedy or something. I didn't know how I got there. Didn't remember Earth. She must be there in the other end of a paradise. So I thought, I'll pick her a nice bouquet of these golden centered flowers. And then I looked at my hand and the thing was already picked and in my hand. Mm-hmm. That's when I exploded to Jesus and I said, tell me about this. All I do is think something, and there it is. And he said, didn't you read my book? He said, that's how I characterized my mind. Whenever I think something, it becomes an act or a fact.
Now, where is that in the book?
Well, that's all through the book when you start looking at it. It is that God formed the earth, it says, with his word. Now, the word is not a spoken word, as we know it, because that takes air to carry it. Mm-hmm. His is a thought word, but it's still a word. So all he had to do was to think a word. Star, moon, sun. Mm-hmm. Think a word. Be there, be there, be there. Whatever he did. Mm-hmm. Think a mud pie that'll be like a man. Mm-hmm. Think a living soul. Mm-hmm. And he said, my son, as soon as I have any thought at all, it is either an act or a fact. And he said, you just experienced that. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the most wonderful thing was that here I'm holding this fantastic bouquet of flowers, and I suddenly realized the stems are bone dry, mm-hmm. as we would know them on Earth. And, of course, I'd held thousands of stems. You have too, and you can feel the moisture. And I said, Jesus, these stems are bone dry. Explain to me why there's no water as I know it. He said, didn't you read the book? He said, I formed the H2O, and that's the way he used it, the hydrogen-oxygen molecule that we call water. I formed the H2O as a substitute for what we have in heaven. And he said, here we have the living water. And he said, everything is nourished with my living water.
Glory.
Isn't that good?
Oh, I love it. How long were you in heaven, Dr. Eby? Having come back, you were dead. How long?
Well, it was at least 2.5 hours before any strange sign of life showed up on the oscilloscope, and then it was not human heartbeats. They didn't know what they were. They were blips. It was approximately, let's say, from 11 a.m. to 6 the next morning, around the clock, until I was put back in this body with my own mind. And that, of course, is another long story. But it was long enough that they decided to request the autopsy in the admitting room where the body had been taken in hopes of finding how come the body had suddenly died. It had no blood. It was obviously a corpse. But what could kill it that fast that it hit the cement and it was dead by the time the paramedics could get there, and they were just around the corner.
Do you still correspond with or keep in touch with the doctor who attended you there?
Well, that's another story. The doctor that attended me, apparently in perfect health, suddenly died 8 weeks later and had refused to believe my story. Another doctor that was involved, we haven't been able to find where he is. The whole thing, the answer is no. I wrote for the records and they had destroyed them. The explanation being that there was no way they could write them and they didn't want to be bothered. So I don't have that verification, but that's human verification. The first thing I heard when I landed in paradise was what you already referred to out of the book, Dick, you're dead. Now this was the voice of Jesus on my ears, obviously, as I was to learn instantly, testifying that I was dead in the sense that Earth would call it, because I didn't feel dead. I was more alive than can be described.
They actually then finally decided to sew your head up and...
Yeah, they couldn't get permission to do the autopsy because I was a Californian that might sue them, was their explanation. And so they sewed the pieces of scalp back over.
I can see the scars.
Yeah, there's just a few left now.
Matt can get close enough, you can still see all the scars.
And then the next morning when Maybelle came